Okay.
Good. Hi, my name is Sophia, and I'm from the Scholar Class of 2025. And today I'm going to be talking a little bit about my research from the past 2 semesters. With me, I have.
Michaela and Haley. So, Sophia, tell us a little bit about your research and what you'll be talking to us today about.
So, my research was about the Russo Ukrainian War, specifically about how companies have both operated and reacted in terms of their public statements as a response to that war. And so, today I kind of want to talk about my results, but because I'll be talking about my results in my live presentation, I also want to dive into the why and why this topic is important and what its real world implications are.
So this seems like a pretty complex topic. How did you get to choose this is what you wanted to study?
Yeah, so my sophomore year, I actually researched different brand images and how those images affect consumer behavior. And then my junior year was a lot of research into international conflicts and how businesses can contribute to peacemaking during international conflicts. And so this year, I kind of wanted to merge those two topics. So what I'm looking at is the difference between what businesses say and what they do. So the difference between their image and their actions. And all of this is kind of in the context of the Russo-Ukrainian war.
So, of all the international conflicts that have been going on recently, and there's been a lot, what made you settle on the Russian Ukrainian war?
Yeah, so I think the thing that sparked my interest in this conflict in particular was an article that I read, which touched upon how so many different companies that we know, like Starbucks, McDonald's, all these big multinational companies were moving out of Russia, largely because the public wanted them to, but also because they had um, difficulties maintaining their operations in Russia during a time of conflict. And so I had previously thought about doing the Israel-Hamas conflict, but that conflict in particular is just so controversial right now. Like if you think about all the protests that have been going on different college campuses, so I kind of wanted to avoid going into a topic that I either had an opinion on, or that I thought would be a little too polarizing. So with that in mind, I just wanted to kick this off with a question to you guys. So, in your opinion, should businesses be involved in international affairs, in politics?
It's a really good question. Right off the top of my head, my inclination is to say businesses should probably hold neutrality just because as a business, your job is to make a profit off of a certain product and to deliver that product to a certain audience. And that shouldn't necessarily be determined by like their politics or what side they take on a certain international affair, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Yeah, I guess my first thought would be businesses should know their audience and probably, again, to make a profit, should cater to those audiences.
Mhm.
So, should side with whatever side the majority of their customers is on.
Mhm. Yeah. So both of you guys kind of talked about neutrality, and that's something that I want to touch on later. But
Yeah. So about like this research topic, how did you go about getting your data and learning what these businesses think and how they behave?
yeah, so I was really lucky. I stumbled across a database called the Yale Sealy List of Companies. I think it's staying and leaving in Russia, and that's basically just a database compiled by I think it's Yale researchers about I think it's about 1,000 companies, whether or not they're staying in Russia, whether or not they're taking a Ukrainian stance or a stance that tends to lean more towards Russia. And it also has a link to their public statements. So it just had everything that I needed for my research, and it was the database I was predominantly relying on. Um, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about my methods. I am going to talk about this, or I will have talked about this in my live presentation. But basically, the way that Yale grades its companies, there's 5 grades, and they're letter grades. So A means that the company is has fully withdrawn from Russia. So they've taken a purely Ukrainian favored stance. The second one is B, which is they've mostly withdrawn from Russia, but they still have little pockets of their company remaining in there. The third one is C, which is scaling back, which means that they're in the process of withdrawing from Russia. D is buying time, which means that they're currently in Russia, but they're kind of claiming to try to take a stance that's against it, but and their actions kind of show that they're still in Russia. And then the letter F means that they're in Russia, they don't plan on leaving, and they're digging in. And so the way my research worked is I took 5 companies and I did case studies in each of them. And for each letter, I had a company that came from a different country and a different industry. So for A, I had the IOC, or the International Olympic Committee. For B, I had TomTom. C, I had Legal in General. D, I had Barilla. And then not G, F, I had a Geoblin. So those are my 5 companies. And basically, my research was just like a case study and a discourse analysis of their public statements to see if those public statements aligned with their actions. And just like as a disclaimer, my research was a case study. So it wasn't like statistical and it can't be generalized. So everything that I say about these 5 companies can literally only be applied to these 5 companies. So yeah, there's a little brief overview of how I did my research.
Can you explain some more of your findings in more depth?
Yeah, so I'll just really quickly go down a list and say what the grades were from the Yale list, and then what my discourse analysis came up with. So for Geoplan, like I said, it was a grade F, and I found that the public statement was largely neutral. And then Barilla was a grade D. The public statement leaned towards Ukraine. Legal in General was the company that got a grade C, and its public statement lead more towards Ukraine, but there were some parts of it that implied that it was more neutral. The same goes for TomTom, which is a grade B, but had a public statement that was very similar to Legal in General. And then the final one was the IOC, which was a grade A, and that was 100% in favor of Ukraine. So one thing that I found with this analysis was that there was no company that was in favor of Russia, which I thought was interesting because you would think that if there's 2 countries on opposite sides of a conflict, that one of them would be in favor of one country and that other companies would be in favor of another. But in this study in specific, I didn't find that. And the furthest towards Russia that I found was neutrality, which I thought was interesting. So yeah, those are the key findings that I had in terms of like specific companies and their case studies. The companies that were more drastic, like Geoplan, which was an F, and then IOC, which was an A, those had public statements that completely matched their actions. But then the middle 3 companies, there was a little bit of gray area, and it seemed as if their words didn't always match with what they did in terms of their operations, but at the same time, it's not like they were completely contradicting each other. So yeah, that was kind of what my research found, like the direct results. But I would say that there are a couple other implications that I didn't set out to find out, but that I came up with as well. So one of those is the comments saying like, "Do your actions match your words?" And originally, I had wanted to look at these companies' advertisements because I felt like that was an area where oftentimes they may not match what they say. But I kind of want to ask you guys, like, how reliable do you believe the information in advertisements is? Like, when you watch an ad, do you automatically let that information sink in, and do you assume it's true, or is it the opposite?
I think like what we were saying earlier, companies like want to make a profit. They want to, I guess, cater to a certain audience. So whenever I see an ad, I'm always like, I don't know how much of this is true or not, or if it's just trying to catch a certain person's eye, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we've spent a lot of time talking, not here, but in school, about ethos, pathos, and logos. And I think a lot of times when I see advertisements, I'm like, oh, they're catering to my pathos or they're catering to my logos. And it kind of makes me distrust them a little bit more and kind of view their information as less reliable.
So those are advertisements, right? So I feel like in general, people tend to take them with a grain of salt because you know that the company is trying to cater towards you. It's literally called an advertisement. But I guess my second question to add on to that is, what is your knowledge of a company's public statements, and how reliable would you find those to be?
Well, it's actually kind of interesting when you were saying you were looking at their public statements. Don't think I've ever looked at a company's public statement on anything. I feel like that's information the public, who it's supposed to be for, doesn't really know unless they're searching for it, which is a really interesting thing to think about, that what you really see from a company is their actions and what they do, not necessarily what they say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree. A lot of times, public statements, I don't see them or don't see them until way after. I will say when you watch the news, sometimes they'll show like a Twitter stream or an Instagram post from a company saying they're going to do all these amazing things and supporting a certain cause. And then a few months later, you look back and you're like, none of this happened.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's so true. So yeah, outside of like my direct results, one of the things that I noticed was how hard it is to find a company's public statement, which again, like Michaela said, is so ironic considering it's
Mhm.
literally called a public statement. So yeah, that was the first thing that I found outside of my direct results that I thought was really interesting. And the second one you guys kind of touched upon in my first question, which is neutrality. So you mentioned that you think businesses should generally stay neutral. Now, what is your opinion, I guess, on neutrality in general, like in the context of both politics and how businesses act?
Yeah, I think especially like in our day and age, everything in like politics specifically, I feel like is really polarized. It's hard to say that you're neutral or that you have a neutral opinion on something because then people will assume, oh, well, then if you don't think what I think, then you think what they think, or
Mm.
vice versa. When it's like you may agree or disagree with aspects of both parties or both sides of an argument. But I think there's value in neutrality in some aspects. Um, but I think at some point, once you start learning more about a topic or a situation, there comes a point in time where you have to say, like, maybe you believe more towards this or more towards that. I don't think it's possible to stay fully neutral in any circumstance.
I think, especially in the national and international arenas, there's a big pull for trying to stay on the right side of history.
Mm.
And so I think because of that, some people try and stay neutral for as long as possible so they see how circumstances play out. Like who wins the war, who wins the election, things like that. So they side with the winners.
Mm.
And for them, it's then easier to be on the so called right side of history. And I think that's why people try and stay neutral because they don't have all the information they want to have. But like Michaela was saying, I think it's really difficult to stay truly neutral. And I think that, especially as a business, um, your customers are going to be calling for you to pick a side, and it may be very important to do so.
Mm. I like that you brought that up because there's a quote that I have from the executive of a multinational company that I interviewed, and he said that there's always going to be colleagues within the company and also external stakeholders that are going to be on either side of a political type conflict. And that's the reason why his company stays neutral is because there's so many people pulling from opposite directions trying to get them to release a public statement or to act in a way that favors maybe like one side of the political spectrum or another. So yeah, that was something that I really took away from this research is how important neutrality is, and that especially in the terms of the Russo-Ukrainian war, neutrality is kind of like a taboo topic because people um, will generally not want to support companies that stay neutral, and the reason being that the media, whether for better or for worse, has depicted Russia as the clear aggressor in this conflict. So neutrality is seen as a way of like hiding, trying to hide behind a bigger nation or just being a coward in general. So in this specific conflict, neutrality is something that has like a negative connotation. Um, but it's interesting that you mentioned that like the election, for instance, where sometimes neutrality isn't necessarily an unwise choice because at the end of the day, you do kind of want to see how things play out, or you just want to get a better understanding of two sides of a conflict. So yeah, that's something that I've really taken away from this research is the like kind of gray area that neutrality fills. And so third, the last implication that I found was the prevalence of philanthropy and attention to employees in times of crisis. So I have here a bunch of quotes from different public statements, but I guess I can just summarize them. So philanthropy is something that's really big in a lot of these companies that I didn't know prior to doing this research. And in almost every single public statement, they mentioned that they were donating either to employees or donating to like humanitarian aid agencies. And so I guess we mentioned that or you two briefly mentioned that you think businesses generally stay neutral in times of conflict because the people that they're catering to are customers and not necessarily like politicians or countries. So my question is, when you think of philanthropy, do you think that falls into falling neutral, or do you think that can come across as taking a side?
I think it depends on what you're giving to. If you're giving to maybe like humanitarian organizations on both sides of a conflict, then I guess it could be either seen as neutral or be seen as playing both sides. So I think when businesses are doing that, they probably need to be really intentional about which organizations are giving to, because that's definitely going to give off a message whether they want it to or not.
Yeah, I would agree. I think if you only give to one certain side, um, people will definitely think you're choosing that side, regardless of if you're giving to the people in the conflict or people affected by the conflict. Um, but like Michaela said, if you're giving to both sides, it definitely feels a little bit like you're playing both sides instead of staying neutral. But it's also hard because if you don't give at all, companies are then asked, wait, what are you doing? Are you only in it for the money? Do you not
Right.
care about your customers?
Yeah.
And again, it goes back to making a profit and trying to cater to the people who are looking to you for answers.
That's interesting that you mentioned that, because one of the other things that was in these public statements is a lot of these companies just tried to avoid mentioning Russia in general. Like they pretended it didn't exist. Like they would say like, we're trying to offer support to our Ukrainian employees and completely disregarding the fact that they have Russian employees, which I also found really interesting. And it kind of ties back to the general topic of neutrality and how that's such a taboo topic, especially in this conflict in particular. So that kind of sums up my research, the implications, and what I kind of took away from it this year. Thank you guys for joining me.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your information with us. It's really fascinating.
Thank you for having us as well.